Love is a serious mental disease. This unsettling line, attributed to Plato, opens a difficult door into one of the oldest paradoxes of human experience, that the very feeling we spend our lives searching for is also the one most capable of destroying our peace. These words are not a rejection of love itself, but a warning about its true nature, that to love deeply is to surrender a part of one's own stability into hands that were never guaranteed to hold it gently. Plato, who saw in love a ladder climbing from bodily desire toward the contemplation of beauty itself, understood that this ladder is never climbed without cost. Every step upward requires giving something away: comfort, control, the illusion of self-sufficiency. What Plato gestures toward here is what we might call the threshold of exposure, the moment a person stops protecting himself and begins, instead, to live partly inside another person's hands. The deeper the love, the wider the exposure. This exposure is not limited to the heart alone, but extends into every corner of a person's inner life, his fears, his history, his need to be seen and understood. When a person allows another human being to matter this much, he hands over something that cannot easily be taken back: the power to wound him precisely where he is most alive. It is as if love opens a door in the self that cannot be closed again, even after the one who walked through it is gone. At this moment, the person who loves deeply discovers that he has built his happiness on a foundation outside his own control, where his effort to hold on pushes him toward the threshold of vulnerability. In this threshold, a deep inner conflict takes shape. This inner conflict is a conflict between the desire for connection and the basic human need for safety. Love, in its essence, is nothing but a long surrender to uncertainty. But this surrender may be lined with thorns that turn tenderness into torment. Søren Kierkegaard understood this torment with unusual precision. In his writing on love, he argued that only a love that risks everything, a love without guarantees, without insurance against loss, deserves to be called love at all. Deep love, for Kierkegaard, cannot be safe by definition. The moment it becomes safe, it has already become something smaller than what it claims to be. Just as the believer leaps into faith without proof, the lover leaps into another person without certainty of return. On the existential level, this paradox turns almost cruel. A person becomes most exposed to suffering precisely when he loves most fully. The individual's crisis in deep attachment is not that love sometimes fails, but that its very depth is what makes failure unbearable, or, more precisely, what makes the ordinary disappointments of intimacy feel like catastrophes. A person who loves with his whole attention, who has memorized another person's silences as carefully as his words, finds himself in a confrontation between the richness this closeness brings and the terrifying cost of losing it. The dilemma is that this love does not offer a guarantee of permanence in exchange for its depth. Instead, it often multiplies the stakes, where every small absence, every unanswered message, every subtle change in tone becomes charged with meaning it would never carry in a shallower bond. He is in a situation where he tries to hold both the joy of connection and the constant, quiet awareness of how much there now is to lose. This condition is embodied by the internal separation between the desire to merge completely with another person and the parallel, contradictory need to remain a distinct self. The deeper a person's attachment grows, the more he risks disappearing into the other, because true intimacy asks a person to soften the very boundaries that once protected him. This individual remains in a constant internal negotiation between his hunger to be fully known and his fear of what being fully known might cost him. And instead of love remaining only a source of comfort, it becomes, for many, a private wound reopened by ordinary life, a song on the radio, an empty side of the bed, a smell that belonged to someone else. This tension between longing and pain is evident in works such as Tolstoy's Anna Karenina, where the author traces the unraveling of a woman who loves with a force too large for the narrow life allowed to her. In the novel, Anna does not fall out of love. She is consumed by the very intensity of a love that society has no room to hold. When she gives herself fully to this love, she discovers that she has separated herself from a social world that cannot forgive the scale of her feeling. This existential separation is evident in her growing isolation from everyone who once anchored her, until she finds herself, in the end, alone with a love too heavy for the life around it to carry. This separation is not simply a conflict with society's judgment, but with the impossible demand deep love makes, to be everything, while remaining safely contained within the limits of ordinary existence. This situation that Anna suffers is not an isolated fictional case, but a reflection of a condition that quietly visits anyone who has loved without holding anything back. The parent who cannot sleep until a grown child answers the phone, the partner who feels a private grief in every small silence, the friend who carries another person's sorrow home with him. Each of these finds himself standing in the same narrow passage, where love's depth becomes indistinguishable from love's danger. This vulnerability that deep love creates is not merely emotional. It is, more precisely, a kind of quiet dependency, an outsourcing of one's own peace to circumstances beyond one's control. In this condition, the individual becomes caught in a steady contradiction between his wish to protect his own stability and the impossibility of loving deeply while keeping any part of himself in reserve. As the attachment deepens, the exposure widens, until he finally understands that love was never simply a shelter, it was also, quietly, a debt collected in the currency of fear. Sigmund Freud, writing on mourning and melancholia, observed that the grief following the loss of someone deeply loved is not proportional to how reasonable that loss was, but to how much of the self had been invested in the other person. When the bond breaks, it can feel as though a portion of one's own identity has been amputated along with it. This is why the end of a deep love so often resembles something closer to a wound than a memory. Because, in Freud's account, a part of the self had, quietly and without permission, moved house into someone else. Roland Barthes, in his study of the language lovers used to describe their own suffering, noted that the lover is a figure suspended permanently between waiting and dread, waiting for a call that may not come, dreading a silence that may mean nothing or everything. For Barthes, this state is not an unfortunate side effect of love but its very structure. To love is to hand a stranger control over one's own emotional weather, and to keep handing it over, day after day, long after reason suggests it might be wiser to stop. Simone Weil pushed this even further, describing attention itself, the deepest, most patient form of noticing another person, as the rarest and most demanding expression of love, one indistinguishable, in her account, from a kind of suffering freely accepted. To truly attend to another human being, while believed, requires setting aside the comfortable noise of the self, and this emptying, however generous, leaves the lover more exposed than he was before, because he has removed the very defenses that once separated his well-being from another person's fate. This raises a difficult question that every person who has loved deeply eventually meets. If love inevitably carries this cost, why does the human heart continue to seek it, again and again, even after being burned by it before? C.S. Lewis addressed this directly, arguing that the only way to avoid the pain love brings is to refuse to give one's heart to anyone or anything, to lock it safely away in a small, hard, uncaring box of self-protection. But Lewis warned that a heart kept this way does not remain safe. It simply becomes unbreakable in the wrong sense, hardening into something incapable of the very tenderness that makes a human life worth living. This is the paradox at the center of the labyrinth. The invulnerability that seems to promise safety is, in truth, its own quiet punishment, a life spent avoiding the one experience most capable of making it feel meaningful. Deep love, then, is not a mistake to be corrected through caution, but a wager whose terms cannot be renegotiated, full exposure in exchange for the only kind of closeness worth calling by that name. Rainer Maria Rilke, writing to a young correspondent about the difficulty of intimacy, suggested that mature love is not a merging that dissolves two people into one, but a meeting of two solitudes that protect, border, and greet each other, a description that, however tender, still concedes the central truth of the labyrinth, even at its healthiest. Love asks two separate, breakable selves to stand permanently within reach of each other's capacity to cause harm. Literature returns again and again to this same discovery, often through characters who choose love knowing its cost in advance. In Gabriel Garcia Marquez's Love in the Time of Cholera, a man waits more than 50 years for a love he cannot have, carrying its weight quietly through an entire lifetime rather than release it. In Emily Bronte's Wuthering Heights, A love so consuming that it outlives its characters becomes, by the novel's own telling, less a comfort than a haunting, a force that destroys as thoroughly as it binds. These stories do not present deep love as a reward without a price. They present it as a fire that warms and burns with the very same flame. On the moral level, then, the labyrinth of deep love raises a question each person has to answer for himself. Is the suffering that accompanies real intimacy a design flaw to be minimized, guarded against, kept at a careful distance? Or is it the unavoidable tuition paid for the only experience capable of enlarging a person beyond the narrow borders of himself? Those who choose distance in the name of safety often discover, later, a quieter and more persistent kind of pain, the suspicion that they protected themselves from suffering by also protecting themselves from being fully alive. In conclusion, the blaze of deep love is not a rare catastrophe reserved for tragic novels or doomed romances. It is a current running beneath the most ordinary human attachments, between parents and children, between old friends, between two people who have simply decided, quietly and without guarantee, to matter to one another. To enter this fire honestly is to recognize that the punishment it exacts is not a sign that love has gone wrong, but proof that it has gone all the way. Perhaps the deepest lesson of this labyrinth is not that deep love should be feared or carefully rationed, but that it should be entered with open eyes. The person who understands love's true cost in advance, who feels the fire and steps toward it anyway, gains something the cautious heart never earns, a life fully lived rather than merely preserved. And in that narrow space between the fear of loss and the refusal to withhold oneself, the entire meaning of what it is to love another person finally comes to rest.